Go ahead, Marilyn.
Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Marilyn O'Connell and I am president of the board of the Vilna Shul. I'm so excited. We have over 350 people with us tonight, and we're super excited to learn more about DNA and genealogy. First, I'd like to thank our partner organizations, the Falmouth Jewish Congregation, the Worcester JCC, who I believe got really hammered with the snowstorm in the last 24 hours, and hope you guys are all doing okay, and the Jewish Book Council. So what is the Vilna? The Vilna organization, the association, was founded in 1888 by Russian immigrants from Vilna Gubernia, the province of Vilna. And the building, the Vilna Synagogue, was built in 1919 and is the only remaining Jewish historic landmark left in downtown Boston. We just completed a $4 million restoration of our historic building. And so we are excited and ready to serve our community in expanded and exciting ways. We're a cultural center, a community center. You can think of us as maybe a small 92nd Street Y, and we're very, very excited to see what the future is going to bring for our organization. As I mentioned, the Vilna was founded in 1888, and by 1893 is the first appearance of the synagogue in the Boston City Directory. So 100 years later, we're going strong. I also want to make a plug for the Jewish Genealogical Society of Greater Boston. For those of you who are interested in just starting out, Lynn, you can post the in the chat the link to the society. Also want to make a shameless plug for a two-part series that we're doing on the how-tos of how to start researching your family. I'm going to do March 23rd at 1 p.m., how to find your great-grandparents without leaving your kitchen computer. The week prior, my friend Margie Sokol will be joining us on March 16th at 1 p.m. to really talk about the power of what it really means to find your ancestors and how it can enrich your lives. So I hope you'll join us for that. Before I hand over the program to our speakers, I would like to outline how tonight is going to work. Our guests will be in conversation with one another, and we will leave the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time together for audience Q&A. You can ask your questions by typing them into the answer box. If you're able, we'd appreciate you filling out the survey that Lynn is going to post in the chat before the end of the evening. We will paste the speakers' full bios into the chat, but I'm so honored to welcome author Libby Copeland and Alice Plebuch to our virtual stage. I'm especially excited because I am a genealogist as well, and we've uncovered a lot of descendants who didn't know that their ancestors had founded the Vilna. So I'm very, very active in research for the Vilna Shul, not just for my own family. So this is super exciting. People ask me all the time about DNA. So Libby and Alice, if you could kindly turn on your cameras, get ready. And Pamela Rothstein from Falmouth Jewish Congregation is going to interview Libby and Alice. So I'd like to turn it over to Pamela.
Good evening, everyone. What a pleasure to be together with such a large crowd. No surprise that this is a topic of great interest to everyone. We all have a stake in determining who we are and where we came from. It's a vital question in our lives. I'm delighted to introduce Libby and Alice. Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist who's written for the Washington Post, New York Magazine, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and many other publications. Libby was a reporter and an editor at the Post for 11 years, has been a media fellow and guest lecturer, and has made numerous appearances on television and radio. Alice Plebuch was the third of Jim and Alice Collins' 7 children. Her earliest years were spent traveling the world as an army brat. Her family eventually settled in California. After graduate school, Alice married and accepted what was supposed to be a short-term clerk assignment at a campus of the University of California. She leveraged her analytical training and was quickly moved up the ranks. She retired from the university as an information systems manager. In her 50s, Alice found an interest in genealogy. Researching her mother's family was rewarding, but her father's ancestry was murky at best. You will learn a lot more. Welcome, Libby and Alice. As you heard, I will be posing questions for roughly 45 minutes or so. We encourage you to send your own questions for the panelists via the Q&A, and I will pose those for you towards the latter part of the program. So we'll start this way. Libby, for you, how did your book, The Lost Family, come to be? And how does Alice's story and her gripping journey to understand her unexpected DNA results fit into that book?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for being here. I'm just thrilled and honored to be here. So how did it come to be? I've been a reporter for about 22 years, and in the last few years, I've become increasingly interested in science writing and in technology and the intersection of technology with our most intimate lives. And a few years ago, I was in conversation with my editor at the Washington Post, and we cooked up an idea for a story that was going to be about how DNA testing sometimes brings unexpected consequences. And then what happens, right? What happens when you pay 99 bucks, you test through Ancestry or 23andMe on a lark, and you find something that totally disrupts your understanding of who you are. And then it's like the what then? And I wanted to follow some of those stories. I was very interested in how that affects people's lives. So I went looking for a story, and I found Alice. And Alice's story, as you will hear, is absolutely remarkable. And I won't sort of tell you her journey. She's going to talk about that in a moment. But needless to say, she discovered unexpected Jewish ancestry. And what was interesting about her particular story is that as she embarked on a kind of a genetic genealogical journey of understanding, trying to understand her DNA results. At a time when the databases were so small, that the job was so hard, that most of us would have easily thrown up our hands. I mean, what she had to do was extraordinary, and it took her many years. She used her very methodical and analytical mind to unravel how this unexpected Jewish ancestry got into her own story. And in the process, she was able to eliminate a lot of sort of expected explanations for this unexpected ancestry and wind up with something very unexpected at the end of her journey. And I wound up writing that story for the Washington Post, and then I got a flood of literally hundreds of emails from people who said, that story was amazing, and now I want to tell you my amazing DNA story. And as I started talking to those people and realizing that this was a big story about essentially American rediscovery and rediscovery of our roots, and kind of reckoning with the past and with our own families and our understanding of the truth and our relationships, I wanted to tell that story in a really big way, and I wanted to tell it across many different demographics. So I went back and I told Alice's story in a kind of a much more fleshed out way. I was able to spend several years working on it and travel to Washington State and meet her, and along the way tell many other stories, because her story is so unusual. But because she was so methodical in kind of testing out her theories of her own DNA unexpected results, she tested out every other theory that there is out there. And so I made her story the spine of the lost family. And along the way, we encounter many other people who, for whom Alice's theories do turn out to be the explanation. She's sort of the unicorn, but there are many people with many different explanations for why they took a DNA test and they got a surprise. So Alice is our kind of our central plot, and she's just an absolutely compelling human being and a compelling story.
Thank you, Libby. That absolutely comes through in the book, and what an ideal subject for a journalist or a documentarian, to have somebody with your skills to match this really compelling story. So Alice, I wonder if you could take us back to the year 2012. What were you expecting when you first took the test, and how did you react at first when the results weren't what you expected?
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for being here. I'm going to enjoy myself. Um, my my father was pure Irish. His parents were Irish immigrants. They came over in 1901 and 1906. And my mother was half Irish, and the rest was a combination of English and Scottish. So I was expecting some mixture having to do with the British Isles. But instead, what I got back was what essentially was half Jewish, and then the rest was the expected mixture of Irish, Scottish, and English. And it was perplexing to me. Something was wrong, and I didn't know what, and I didn't know how to understand it. And I started looking at the chat groups in Ancestry, and there were a lot of people who were saying that they got bad ancestry results. And specifically, they were saying they had too much Swedish. There was nobody else who had too much Jewish. And I started asking my family, hey, what do you think's going on here? And I've had brothers who told me I was crazy, that I had a great imagination. And my sister said, did you ever notice we don't look like grandpa? So that's what's happening in 2012. I am totally confused. And actually, not only was I confused, but I was a little upset with Ancestry that they were giving me bad results. And so it was still in beta at the time. And I wrote, hey, you guys got to fix up your algorithm. It's just wrong. I never did hear back from them. I did eventually write to them and apologize. Marilyn, did I?
Thank you. Libby, coming back to the broader topic of DNA testing and genetic testing, can you talk to us about how many people have taken a test? I imagine it's growing rapidly by the day, and how common are unexpected results?
Yeah, so if it helps, I'll kind of situate Alice in the broader story of direct-to-consumer DNA testing. This is an industry that has been around for just over 20 years. It's broadly known as recreational DNA testing, and that is a kind of a moniker that it is taken on to distinguish it from the kind of DNA test that you might get in the doctor's office for health-related results. But in fact, its results are often far more profound than the term recreational implies, and you'll see that with Alice's story and with indeed many others. So when Alice tested, this was back in 2012, as she mentioned, the company Ancestry, which would become the behemoth in the space. I mean, they have the biggest database right now. They had just unveiled this type of DNA test, and it was in beta testing, and so their databases were very, very small. It wasn't till about 2013 that there were 1 million people who had tested through this kind of DNA testing across all the databases added together. So that was 2013. So what's that, 8 years ago? We're now in 2021. That doesn't seem like a very long time ago, 8 years. But in that time, the size of the DNA databases have gone from 1 million to over 35 million. And that is really important to know because for a number of reasons. First of all, it tells a broader story about sort of the velocity of interest in the United States, particularly because most people who are testing are American, in genealogy and in genetic ancestry. So people are really curious. They're in a moment right now where they're kind of wondering about the roots, and DNA testing, which is very inexpensive, relatively compared to what it would have cost, 20 years ago. Has really taken off in that way. Because the majority of people in these databases are American, that means that there are so many people in the databases that if you if you have not tested at this particular moment in time, if you were to test at a company like Ancestry, you would find on average 50,000 DNA cousins in their database already, just waiting for you. Now, these are people you don't know, but they are people who, for the most part, you might know some people who are very closely related to you. Many of them are distant cousins, but they share overlapping genetic segments. And increasingly, we are all sort of affected by this technology, whether or not we choose to test. I say in the Lost Family that, the era of genetic family secrets is over, because increasingly people are discovering, for instance, the truth about their genetic origins. They're discovering they're not related to dad. They're discovering they have an older sibling they didn't know about. And in fact, you don't even need to take a DNA test in order for a family secret to come out within your own family. So you can be affected by this technology without ever spitting into a tube. There's a number of different categories of unexpected results. And I'm going to put Alice to the side for a minute because, as I said before, she is an absolute unicorn, and we're going to talk about her particular circumstances. But they're very surprising. But much more common, if a person were to test, would be that they might discover, if first of all, most people are not getting a surprise. Most people are just getting deeper to their roots, and they're understanding sort of the immediacy of the past. If they are getting a surprise, then most likely they're getting the discovery that they are the product of a non-paternity event, or an NPE, that they're not genetically related to dad, typically, or that they might have a sibling or half sibling they didn't know about. These are the sort of two most common types of unexpected results that you can get from DNA testing. People sometimes discover they're adopted and they weren't told. They sometimes discover they were donor conceived and they weren't told. And they might discover that they have hidden genetic ancestry. And most of these theories are things that Alice, in her incredible methodical wisdom, managed to come up, theorize about, and then investigate and knock down until she finally came to her ultimate explanation. So how common are these? Certainly, if you take all these scenarios together, they are in the low single digits. That's a very conservative estimate, easily spread across 35 million people. That's at least a million people getting significant unexpected surprises of the type I just laid out. But in fact, the true impact is much bigger, because for each person who makes the discovery, there's often a whole family and sometimes two families that are affected. So if, for instance, I discover I'm not genetically related to my dad, it has implications for me, for him, for my mom, for my siblings. And now there's another family out there that I'm discovering I'm related to. There's a man who is a stranger who contributed half my genetic material. I'm learning I'm related to him. This has implications for his wife and for his children, who I'm now discovering are my half siblings, genetically speaking. So this is a broad phenomenon that's affecting millions of Americans right now. And I think you're still muted, Pamela.
Yep, there we go. Question for Alice. You addressed this a bit, but I wonder if you could expand a bit on what it's like to get results that don't fit your understanding of who you are, and what are the emotions that accompanied your discovery before you understood the explanation. And that was a long period of time. So over the course of years, and how did this impact your life?
Actually, when I first got my results, I was, as I mentioned, perplexed, totally perplexed. And then when my sister did mention something that I knew, that we didn't look anything like our one picture we had of our grandfather, we decided that we needed to do some additional testing. And we tested at 23andMe. My sister tested, and we decided also we had to know exactly which side of the family was the Jewish side. We thought it was my dad, but we weren't sure. And so we tested my mother's nephew and my father's nephew. And we did it, we had to know. That was the thing. We had to know at this point what was going on, if anything. And it seemed to take forever to get our results back. And I immediately found out that my brother had previously tested at 23andMe, and we were full brother and sister. And that was a relief, because that eliminated the possibility, we thought, that my father wasn't my father, because my brother and I were full siblings. And it was always in the back of my mind. I couldn't get rid of it, even though I knew I looked like my dad, and the likelihood of my mother cheating on my father was pretty nil. So we had to wait and wait and wait. And it was a feeling, it was a period of a lot of anxiety. What is going on? And then we got the results back. And my father's nephew, we had absolutely no genetic relationship whatsoever. We were first cousins to my mother's nephew, but when we got my cousin's results back, my it was like my whole world dropped, because it meant we weren't related to my father's family. It meant my father wasn't related to his family. And something that hasn't been mentioned is my father was raised in an orphanage. His mother, his Irish mother, died when he was 9 months old, and his Irish father put them in the orphanage when none of their relatives would take the kids in. So, in one fell swoop, we lost my father's whole family. Plus, he had a lot of, uh, his whole life was invested in being Irish because he didn't have family. My mother had family, and the family he knew from my mother were Irish. He knew my mother's family. So it was like a huge portion of my identity just fell away. And I was totally adrift. I spoke to my sister. She felt the same way too, that we both were totally confused. How could dad not be Irish, and how could he not be related to his nephew? No relationship whatsoever. So we started out with, well, his mother cheated, except his nephew was his sister's child. And because of that, you can't you can't do cheating, um, because there's always a direct relationship. So we knew that his mother, my father's mother, was not his mother, or he would have matched my nephew. We knew his father couldn't be his father, or he would have matched my nephew. So we had to come to grips with something was wrong. We went through every possible scenario you can imagine, the Irish gypsies, and whether or not somebody who was Jewish came over and chose to assume an Irish identity, but we could throw it all out because we knew we weren't related to our Irish folks. And at that point, we decided we needed to know who my father's family was. My father was no longer alive, but he was very important to us, and we felt that we had to honor him by finding his family.
Thank you, Alice, for sharing that. Um, Libby, can you talk to us about what you've learned in your interviews with the many DNA testing consumers, and how DNA results can profoundly change people's lives, as we've heard from Alice how it did hers? And how does that contrast with people's expectations and assumptions going into testing, which is something you
Yeah.
cover well in the book?
Yeah, yeah. So I was particularly interested in sort of this contrast between the way that consumer DNA testing is marketed, very much as something that's going to bring you understanding of yourself, but often with a certain level of psychological and emotional remove. We've all seen the ads. Ancestry, in particular, has a lot of ads that are very effective, I think, at hitting this idea that you're going to go on a process of discovery. You might discover you're Italian, and you might see a celebrity going through an Italian bakery buying biscotti, and she's like, "I'm reclaiming my Italianness," right? And there's this sense that um, that you're getting the kind of treat of discovery, and in fact, often that is what it is. Um, But what I found was that that people often aren't prepared for the more serious implications, the degree to which they may not even know that they're asking a particular question, right? When you take a DNA test, you might be only interested in that ethnicity estimate, right? That circle pie chart that tells you what percent Swedish you are, for instance. You're not asking, do I have any, additional sibling that I didn't know about that my parents never disclosed, right? But you're going to potentially find that whether or not you've asked the question. And that is a kind of a mismatch between the stakes that we think about when we go into it. You pay $69 because it's on sale and it's fun and it's a form of entertainment, or you get it as a gift for Christmas, or you get it as a gift for Hanukkah, which is how I got my first kit. The stakes going in and then the stakes coming out, it can be a really profound exchange and a really profound discovery. And I don't mean to be overly cautionary, because that discovery can be profound in a really, really good way, but it's just to say that it can be a really big deal. Alice used a phrase. She said that she felt adrift when she made her discovery that she was half Ashkenazi Jewish rather than entirely British Isles and primarily Irish. Okay. That phrase adrift stuck with me. I have always thought about it. And as I started doing interviews, and I ultimately corresponded with or interviewed over 400 people for The Lost Family, I heard some variation on that notion of being adrift over and over. So much that I came to calling this the lonely boat metaphor. And that is because over and over I heard a description of a sense of discovering, for instance, that you are not related to people you thought you're related to, or that you're cut off in some way from the roots that you understood to be your roots, as a sense of floating in the water, as a sense of separation from people that you thought you were related to. So one woman that I interviewed said that she felt as if she had been placed on a raft, and that she had been pushed out to sea. Right. And that's another example of the lonely boat metaphor. Often when people discover a major surprise like this, like Alice did, certainly some people sort of back away, or they say this is too daunting, or this doesn't make any sense, or I don't believe it. But a lot of times they dive in with both hands, because they're incredibly curious, and because even if the news is potentially painful, because of what it says about their family or a relationship with someone they trusted who maybe didn't tell them something, we as a culture place such premium on the truth and on knowing the truth about your own genetic origins that once people get past the initial stage of potentially some denial, the stage where you write to Ancestry as Alice did and say, hey, you guys screwed up, you don't know what you're doing. Once you get past that stage and you start to wonder a little bit more, very often people launch into an investigation, and it's an investigation of the self. It's an existential detective mystery in the case of Alice. And that turns us into seekers. And seekers are sort of a phenomenon that I wanted to write about in The Lost Family, because I think we are in a moment where genealogy and DNA testing are so big, and looking backward as a means of understanding the present is so important in our culture right now, that as a nation, we have become seekers. We have become people who are invested in this idea that we're going to better understand ourselves and the present by looking backward and deepening our understanding of the past.
Indeed, the one comes away from reading the book with that word seekers absolutely embedded in it. It absolutely is relevant to us as a nation. How do we seek our identity, and to us as people? So now I'm going to turn to Alice for the big reveal. We want you to discuss how, after your 2 years of intense research, I'd like you to discuss really how you did that, because you brought very specific skills to this task that otherwise may not have ended in an answer, actually. And what did you discover about your family?
Well, to start out with, I had my whole family helping me. I just want to make that clear. My eldest brother wrote a computer program that allowed me to compare the DNA from all of us to the people we matched. And we started whittling down what the possibilities were. There were theories that maybe when my Irish grandmother gave birth, her child died, and they gave her a live baby. Um, as I said earlier, the Irish gypsies or the gypsies. A lot of weird things, and they were complicated. So we got down to what we thought was the simplest, most possible explanation was that my father got switched at birth. And we only did that after I think we had already tested our cousins. And I always knew that my father was born in a hospital. Actually, I didn't always know, but I had his birth certificate. And when I looked at it, it said he was born at Fordham Hospital. It was stamped all over his birth certificate. And so we thought, well, if he was born in a hospital, what are the different possibilities? Because we thought a mother would know if her child wasn't her child, if she had been with them for a little bit. And it was, I'll bet you that he was swapped with another baby born at the same time. So from very early on, that was our theory. And I used to write to everybody and tell them, I'd introduce myself and say, we're looking for my grandparents. We think my father was swapped at birth. And of course, everybody thinks we're a little bit crazy, but they helped. It wasn't, I'm adopted or anything, because they don't answer adoption questions as much. And as I mentioned earlier, we did have my cousin's DNA, my real Irish cousin's DNA, who wasn't my cousin. And every once in a while, I would look at his matches. My brother had suggested keep an eye on them, but I only checked them about once a month because, truthfully, they did not change very much. The Irish apparently don't test as much as the Jewish do. And one day, or actually it was at night, I was going to write to him and say, I'm sorry, Pete, I'm not making any inroads. I'm really kind of getting depressed. And I went out and I checked his matches. And he had a match there that I knew from seeing so many that the person was a first cousin once removed from him. And she was listed as anonymous. And so I wrote to her and asked her would she like to help solve a mystery, 100-year-old mystery, and she said sure. And when I asked her about the different Irish surnames, she said something to the effect of, it's very strange. I was expecting to find Jewish, but I'm seeing Irish instead. And at that point, I already knew that her grandfather was swapped with my dad. And we spent the night texting and then later on talking back and forth. And sure enough, her father was born or her grandfather was born on the same day at Fordham Hospital, delivered by the same doctor. And we shared pictures, and I'm going to start getting emotional because it was the first time I saw anybody in my family's face other than my nuclear family. It was just so touching to me. So that's what we discovered. Dad really was swapped at birth.
Okay. Thank you. Libby, there's all sorts of stories connected to that. It's just, there's so much beneath the surface there that comes out in the book. Can you discuss and tell us about what you found out about maternity wards at that time in history,
Yeah.
which contributed to this story?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about that. And I don't know if we have a picture of Jim Collins. If we have one queued up, we can certainly pull it up this time. If we don't, that's fine. Jim is Alice's dad, Jim Collins. And oh, there he is. you can see, well, he was briefly on. He does look like Alice. He's obviously it's not alive anymore. But he was born in 1913. And one of the things that was so key to understanding this circumstances is understanding the history of early maternity wards in the United States. And so one of the pleasures of reporting first for the Washington Post piece and then for The Lost Family was understanding how maternity wards came to be and what kind of protections they did or did not have for the little babies that were born in them. So there are pictures you can find, and I regret that I don't have one that I can share here, but there are pictures you can find of babies, 15 babies, on a cart in a Manhattan maternity home in 1912. So this is a different hospital, but right around the same time when Jim was born. And they are all piled up, I write in the book, like cabbages in a supermarket, on a supermarket shelf, right? They are not tagged. They are not labeled. They are not separated. They are draped across each other on a cart. And it was not until decades later that it became commonplace for mothers and babies to be identified with matching wristlets or bracelets. That was something they had to come to. And in the very beginning, they just assumed that a mother would know her child. Now, you have to understand that if you were giving birth at this time, you would not have had a lot of contact with your baby. You may have been drugged with the early drugs that they had available to them, which might have altered your consciousness. You would have been flat on your back for easily 12 days, and your movements would have been restricted. So, the nurses, from what I can understand, and again, this was like one of the most magical parts of reporting the story, was getting to dig into the old obstetrics practice booklets from 1912, just because it's so drastically different. But the nurses would come in and they would take a baby away. They would care for the baby. They would keep the baby separate. They would bring the baby back briefly. Then they would take the baby back again. There was so much movement back and forth, and there was so little time for the mother to have the baby with her in her arms that you can easily understand how in the first or second interaction with a baby over that long period of time, the nurse might have simply given the wrong baby to the wrong mother. And even in cases when the mothers had a sixth sense, if you look back in the history, some of the sort of medical literature, there were even cases when mothers protested and said, "I think I've been given the wrong baby." And the system was so paternalistic that sometimes those mothers were told, "You're wrong and go home with this baby." So, women might have quelled their doubts. They may not have had doubts. And what happened in 1913 in that hospital was that there was a young Irish immigrant mother, and there was a Russian Jewish mother. They were in the same space, generally speaking. They were given the wrong babies. They took those babies home. And what's absolutely stunning about Alice, and there are some pictures in the book and pictures that she has that really illustrate the case, is that Alice and her family are generally pretty short. Alice is, I think she likes to say, 5 feet if she's lucky. Her dad was 5'4", I believe. The boy that he was swapped with would turn out to be 6'4", I think. So they were a full, foot in height difference. And of course, their parents were comparatively also very tall and very short. So for Alice's dad, this wasn't so relevant because he wound up in an orphanage and he didn't grow up around family quite so much. But there's a woman on the other side of this story. I like to call her like Alice on the other side of the looking glass, and her name is Pam. And Pam is the woman whose father was switched with Alice's father. And she talks a lot, and I interviewed her for the book, about, sort of her father's experience of being a 6'4" man with a father who was 5'4" and a mother who was 4'9".
Actually, he was
Irish
only
men.
5'2".
What's that?
His father was only 5'2".
5'2". So thank you for that. So, that sense of disconnection that these two men lived out their lives and died never understanding. And it took their descendants and this fascinating technology to be able to understand the context for their lives.
Thank you, Libby. Absolutely, those pictures in the book really bring all these issues to light. And you faced another obstacle in the record keeping at the maternity ward, in that one of the names was incorrectly noted. So all sorts of levels of challenges that came up. Alice, wonder if you can tell us about the reactions of you and your siblings. There were 7 of you, 2 girls, 5 boys. How did this affect each of you in turn?
My sister and I talked about this, and we think as a family, we were similarly affected in that we look at our father a little bit differently now. We see him as not having lived the life that he was going to live, and we feel really badly that he grew up in an orphanage without a family to love him. And yet, on the other hand, Philip, the other boy, all what we really wanted for him was him to be happy more than anything. We didn't want him to have a miserable life because our dad would have had a miserable life. Having said that, my sister and I are much more closely, I don't want to say aligned, that's not quite the word. We're closer to our Jewish sides, let's put it that way, to our inner Jewish person than our brothers are. And one of the big family arguments has been over time whether or not dad was really Irish or Jewish. And some of most of the brothers think that our dad was, even though he wasn't biologically Irish, that since he was raised as Irish, he was Irish. Um, I certainly don't. I see that my father was really somebody who was Jewish, who was raised to believe he was Irish. And one way I've kind of come to grips and to settle it with brothers is that I never talk about my father as being Jewish anymore. I now refer to him as being Ashkenazi, because by being Ashkenazi, that's a race, and that's genetic, that's real. And that's something that my brothers can accept, that it's no different than saying somebody was French versus being English. They were raised to think that they were English, but they were really French. So taking religion out of it makes it much easier for them to say, yeah, he really was an Ashkenazi who was raised as an Irishman. So for us, we all are just thrilled to have dad's family. We love them to death. But some brothers had a little bit of a difficulty of getting over the fact that my father, even though he was raised as Irish, really wasn't Irish.
I want to remind everyone that in a few minutes we'll turn to your questions, and if you would, please send those through the Q&A rather than the chat. A few closing questions for the two of you. Libby, why do you argue that these stories matter for people who haven't experienced a surprise and may not even have ever taken a DNA test or plan to? Why tell this story?
A couple of reasons. Maybe the more surfaced reason is that somewhere between 7 and 8% of the American population is represented in these commercial DNA databases. And that means that whether or not you've tested, right, somebody you're related to genetically, whether or not you know them, is tested. And as I was saying earlier, that means that we've achieved a kind of a tipping point where facts about your family and facts about yourself may come out whether or not you choose to test. So that's part of it. But I think the bigger question and the bigger truth that I see elucidated by Alice's story and many others that I've told in the Lost Family and just people that I've interviewed in general is that, and I think Alice's story does this with such beauty. She really elucidates these essential human questions that I think we've always sort of grappled with about the who am I, right? And as you can see from Alice's situation and her family with the 7 siblings, each one answers this question differently. And I think that's very important. You take a DNA test, you decide what those results mean for you. You discover you're not genetically related to your dad. You decide whether or not you still call him dad, and you may well. And maybe you lack the language for the relationship with the man who contributed half your genetic material, but you also want a relationship with him. And if that's the case, then that's a failure of language rather than a failure of the human heart. And so increasingly what I've found is that when I interview people who discover that their family isn't what they thought, or that their genetic ancestry isn't what they thought, that they resolve those questions with great nuance and emotional delicacy. And I found that to be true in Alice's family, and I found that to be true over and over again. That people are generally, not always, but often, particularly when the discovery is about themselves, they're generally kind of open-hearted in terms of saying yes to both, yes to experience and to genetics, right? I am both. I'm not one or the other. I'm not throwing away a lifetime of experience in favor of my genes. I'm not elevating my genes to some sort of fortune-telling capacity, but nor am I ignoring this truth that maybe was hidden from me because of family circumstances, or because, in Alice's case, of a historical accident. Neither am I pretending that it doesn't mean anything, because man, it really, really does. At least it certainly does to Alice. And so that question of who am I, right? And who would I have been in different circumstances? Man, it's mind-blowing to think about who Jim Collins would have been in different circumstances. And you kind of almost can't go down that road. As Alice has told me before, she and her siblings can't go down that road, because to invite this question of what if he had had this other life that he was supposed to have, then they would be inviting the fact that they would not exist. And so, you kind of, it's a kind of a crazy mental space that you can get yourself into. But here we are. And I think that we, I know certainly, you know that people wonder things about who they would have been if they had been raised in different circumstances, raised by that family across the street. What if I wasn't really related to my parents? And some people wish that they weren't. And those questions about who am I essentially, those are brought to light in a really dramatic way by the DNA age. And that's why I think these questions that we're engaging with, whether or not you're into genealogy and whether or not you're into DNA testing, these questions that we're engaging with are fascinating. And there's something for us all to think about.
Thank you, Libby. Alice, question for you: is DNA testing a good thing? And if you had it to do all over again, would you test?
I'd be the first one in line. So yes, I would test again. If I hadn't tested, we never would have found our wonderful family. I still have my Irish cousin, but I have this whole other family that when I met them, it was like coming home. And all my brothers and my sisters say the same thing. They have such a close connection to Dad's birth family that it's really hard to believe. Even my brothers who, they don't say hello to anybody. When they start thinking about their family, boy, these other people are part of our family, and we feel incredibly close. That's on a personal level. Um, on a sociological level, I think it's a good idea. Um, Everybody I know that has tested has enjoyed it, and they found out something interesting about themselves. And I'd say about half of them had a surprise. It wasn't quite as big a surprise as ours, but they found an aunt who had a child they never knew about. Um, I have one family that we're related to where it turns out everybody had other children, and they've all gotten together, and they see it as a road to family. Also, I think it's a really good idea, and people may not like this, but to allow the police to use it to find violent criminals, people who have gone for years evading the law and killing people or raping people. I think it's helped society too.
Thank you. Alice, I actually have another question for you about the discussions that you and your siblings have had over the years about what, if anything, you would have told your dad about his true identity if he were alive, and how your thoughts about that have evolved or changed.
I'm probably the one who has changed the most. My The rest of my family was right out. I'd tell Dad. He would have needed to know. And my first reaction was to protect him and not to know, to tell him. And the the moment, I have a moment that I knew I would have told him, and that's when I first met over FaceTime my cousin Phyllis, and we're talking, and at one point she said, "Such is life." And it wasn't the words, because I've heard them from many people, but she had the exact same inflection as Dad did. It was like hearing him again. And I realized, he really needed to know. If he could have known, he would have loved his family. It would have been instant love, because for him, he grew up without a family. My mother's family is what he had. He never had his own, and this would have given him his own. So,
Thank you. We're going to turn to audience questions now. I want to remind you to please pose those through the Q&A. I see they're coming in now. I will do my best to ask as many of those as possible. We have roughly 15 or 20 minutes. Here's one. The premise of your discussion is that who we are is related to genetics. While this is obviously true in a biologic sense and has health implications, is it not also true that who we are is related to the family that raised us? How have the people you interviewed dealt with this conundrum?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that comes back to this kind of yes and. I found that for the seekers, so that was people who took a DNA test and they discovered something surprising about their own genetic origins. That was sort of probably the biggest category of people that I interviewed. For those people, they wanted to know as much as they could, but that did not necessarily translate into a kind of a rejection of the people that had raised them, unless there was already some estrangement there, in which case that the DNA test was not so much the cause of it as a kind of a continuance of it. But for the most part, I'll tell you a story of a woman named Lori, for instance, who I write about in the book. She takes a DNA test. She discovers she's not genetically related to her dad. She never tells her dad. And when he passes away, he was elderly at the time, she did, start the search to find out who her genetic father was, but she never called her genetic father dad. She said to me, the man who raised me is dad. Like, I can't imagine calling anyone else that name because this is the guy who did the job, right? Um, and yet, for this woman, for Lori, also understanding where she'd come from on a genetic level was very important. And she tried to reach out to the man who was her genetic father. He didn't want a relationship. And this goes to one of the kind of, tricky collisions that you get into when you start learning about these stories. And I tried to tell some of these family stories in a bit of a 360 because the reactions are so different. For the people who are trying to understand their own genetic origins, they very often want contact or at least some knowledge of where they come from. They may be in a situation where they were essentially kept a secret, and they don't want to be a secret, and they're in the awkward position of announcing to a family that maybe doesn't know that they exist, or some members don't know they exist, hey, I exist. And that can be really stressful for them because sometimes the people on the other side, the people who are confronted with a person existing whose very existence conflicts with certain family narratives, right? That dad was loyal to mom, for instance, or that there was nobody before mom for dad, or that dad told us the whole truth about everything. That is incredibly sometimes threatening to that father, to the siblings of the person who's coming into their life. So there's a contrast there then between the person who's seeking and the seekees or the secret keepers. And there's different emphasis, I guess I would say, in answer to that question. The question's about this idea that, like, how much do you value, what came before genetics? For a lot of people, they're looking at both tracks. And sometimes for the people on the other side, they want things to stay as they were before, and they are not particularly interested in this biological revelation. And that collision of interests between your desire to know who you are through understanding your biology and my desire for privacy, for instance, can lead to really difficult, stressful situations. And it doesn't always end well. It's, Alice's situation is this really gorgeous story of open-heartedness and discovery. And a lot of the stories are that. And then there are the stories where the fathers delete their kits. And then there are the stories where the fathers have their attorneys send letters to their biological children saying, I don't want you to contact me anymore. There are the stories of the siblings who say, we don't believe the DNA test because we don't believe our mother would have put a child up for adoption. So, you sort of see the whole sweep of human history in the last few decades, right? The whole kind of sweep of diverging interests in these really compelling family stories.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. I'm going to sort of combine two. One is, Alice, do you have children of your own? And if so, how are they dealing with the new reality of their ancestry? And another one is asked of you, but I would put it to you and regarding your children too. Have you connected to the Jewish side? Has anybody explored Judaism or studied Judaism as a result of your search results?
Okay, I have 3 sons, and they all have different reactions. My eldest son and my youngest son, um, they've all met. They went on the family cruise. They got to meet their cousins. They have a feeling of kinship with them. I remember my youngest son was really surprised how well he got along with his cousins. He rather enjoyed them. Um, I have one son, I think it might be, I could be wrong because I drove him crazy when I was obsessively looking. He doesn't want to hear anything about it. He absolutely doesn't want to hear anything about it. And I don't think it has anything to do with religion or anything. He thinks of his grandparents as being the ones who just gave grandpa away. And it's sort of like, where did you come from, child? I never met you. So I have really extreme differences. Uh, Judaism is something that my best friend when I was young was Jewish, and she always wanted me to be Jewish when I grew up. Did I say she? I said I always wanted to be Jewish when I grew up, and Paul Newman um, made that a little bit stronger. My first boyfriend was Jewish. I'm not a terribly religious person. I was raised as Catholic. I was a fallen Catholic. Um, but I've always flirted with Judaism. And now I belong to a Jewish women's group. I'm not ready to do any conversions, but that's because I don't want to join any formal religion. I'm sorry, that's me. And my sister also, her first boyfriend was Jewish. And she's like me. I think she recently joined a women's Jewish group. Um, I, my brothers, three of them are extremely religious. Two of them are Catholic, extremely religious, and one is do you remember what it is? I forget what to call it. The astrologer. Um, One of my brothers is an Eastern religion advocate. Um, so, the family comes from extremely different religious views. Did I answer the question? It's hard to.
Absolutely. And religious, it's partly a question of semantics and how we define it, but you certainly answered the question of how you relate to Judaism and the nature of your interest. Thank you. Somebody asked, do either of you have experience working with a private investigator to search for ancestors using DNA or using DNA or other genealogical tools? And I'll attach to that a question about any recommendations you have in terms of specifically Jewish genealogical testing and research.
Yeah, so I don't have experience working with private investigators. The DNA testing age has given rise to the field of genetic genealogy. And a subset of genetic genealogists are what are known as search angels. The search angels are people who kind of volunteer to hold your hand and help you understand your DNA results. And they're not sort of formal, they have varying degrees of expertise. And there are a lot of Facebook groups that are devoted to helping people with their genealogy or their genetic genealogy, and on those groups are people who will help you often, whether just by commenting and directing you to more resources, or on occasion search angels will take on cases. So for instance, a person who's adopted and they're having trouble finding a birth mother, they might be able to work with a search angel or hire a search angel. Some of them will charge depending on the job. And so that's all sort of stuff that's out there. In terms of Jewish genealogy and Jewish genetic genealogy, there's a couple of good Facebook groups, and there's many good Facebook groups, but one in particular that's good for genetic genealogy. So if you've done a DNA test and you want to understand your results, is called Jewish DNA for Genetic Genealogy and Family. Jewish DNA for Genetic Genealogy and Family, and that's on Facebook. And there are also Facebook groups for just straight Jewish genealogy, just looking at the paper records, not DNA. So a very well-known one is called Tracing the Tribe, and that's also on Facebook. So those are a couple of recommendations. And
Thank you.
yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead.
We are done with the Q&A portion, and now my colleague Nancy Greenberg is going to conclude the program. Thank you both for answering those. Thank you, audience, for posing questions.
Hello, I'm Nancy Greenberg, Cultural Arts Director of the Worcester JCC. On behalf of the Vilna, Falmouth Jewish Congregation, the Worcester JCC, and Jewish Book Council, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Libby Copeland and Alice Plebuch for a deeply thought-provoking conversation about the consequences, intended and otherwise, of DNA testing. If you haven't already, I highly recommend that you read The Lost Family before you spit in that vial. Copies of The Lost Family, signed and personalized by Libby Copeland, can be purchased through the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. And be sure to sign up for Libby's newsletter for more stories on genealogy and DNA at libbycopeland.com. This information has been posted in the chat. The Lost Family is also available through Falmouth's independent bookstore, 8 Cousins, that's 8cousins.com, and at bookshop.org and Amazon. Please join us for these upcoming virtual partnership programs. The Jewish Side of Paris, a virtual tour, Tuesday, March 2nd at 7 p.m. with tour guide Karen Reb Rudel, owner and founder of Seeker's Delight, a walking tour company in Paris. Award-winning author Talia Karner will discuss her new book, The Third Daughter, on Thursday, March 11th at 3 p.m. That's Eastern Standard Time. And Pamela Nadell, author of America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, winner of the 2019 National Jewish Book Award. That's Thursday, March 18th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please note that the link with tonight's recorded program and details about all the upcoming partnership events will be sent out by email tomorrow, along with the information about how to purchase signed and personalized copies of The Lost Family and how to subscribe to Libby Copeland's newsletter. Thank you to my colleagues, Lynn Krasker-Schultz of the Vilna and Pamela Rothstein of Falmouth Jewish Congregation, as always. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you, everyone, and good night from all of us.